12 years ago, World Trade Organization negotiators created what became known as the Doha round of trade talks. Since then, the talks have taken a back seat in the face of regional deals and other vested interests. Are the Doha talks dead, and do we still need a global deal on trade? INSEAD Associate Professor of Economics Pushan Dutt joins us now. Pushan, thanks for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you for having me.
Pushan, your paper, The Effect of WTO on the Extensive and Intensive Margins of Trade, essentially examines the effect of WTO membership on trade flows. How has WTO membership affected trade?
So let me give a bit of background here. A few years ago, an interesting piece of research comes out which basically looks at the effect of the WTO on trade and finds that it has had no impact on trade. So what it does is something very simple. It looks at pairs of countries where both these pairs are members of the WTO and pairs of countries where at least one is not a member of the WTO, and it compares the amount of trade in these country pairs. And it finds that it's not really that different. So therefore this implies that the WTO has not been very effective in terms of raising trade. Now this basically questions the objective of the existence of the WTO, because the singular objective of the WTO is to raise trade, and it does not seem to be doing so. So this was a shocking result, and it led to much soul searching amongst economists and policymakers. So then people started looking at certain different aspects, and they said, well, the WTO has lots of different exceptions. So for instance, certain sectors were not liberalized, some countries did not have to liberalize their trade, and once you take into account these exceptions, then the WTO does have an impact on trade. What our work does is something different. What we do is we decompose trade into two things. One is, now my exports to a particular country could be going up because I'm exporting more products, or because I'm exporting more of each product. Okay, so we show that the WTO affects the first thing, that when you become a member of the WTO, you tend to export more products.
And how does WTO membership affect the cost of trade? What is the impact?
What we show is that the WTO works more like affecting the fixed costs of trade, because when I have it affecting the fixed cost of trade, then I only get entry. The incumbents have already incurred this fixed cost, so they do not actually increase the volume of exports, right? So that doesn't change, but I get entry by these small new exporters, so that raises the extensive margin. More products being exported, but there is not much impact on the volume, the average exports per product.
Your paper also raised the intriguing concept that perhaps the WTO is not all about reducing trade barriers, that perhaps it also serves to reduce uncertainty in global trade. Does this mean that there's increasing room for more bilateral deals, be they region to region or country to country?
See, when a country becomes a member of the WTO, it basically commits to certain trade policies. Now, at what level it commits, we feel is less important. The commitment per se is more important. So if I'm a firm, and the importing country becomes where I want to sell to, the importing country becomes a member of the WTO, I'm now assured that the trade policies will not change suddenly. Okay? They will be basically stable. So it's basically a signal of commitment to some stable trade policies. Preferential trading agreements, these bilateral trading agreements, actually affect trade through these more boring channels. It reduces trade barriers, and it raises trade between pairs of countries, but because it's just simply reducing trade barriers. Of course, today we are doing a lot more of these bilateral trading arrangements because the Doha round of trade talks have sort of frozen.
And where does this leave the Doha round of trade talks? Are they indeed dead?
There are three things which are stopping the Doha round of trade talks. So the first is that the issues are extremely complex. They want trade agreements on very broad sectors like agriculture, textile, services. Second, most of the countries have a mercantilist attitude, even today, towards trade. They basically want access to other countries' markets, but they don't want to give access to their own market to other countries. And finally, the WTO works by consensus, that all of the 157 odd countries have to agree before anything gets done. So because, nothing gets agreed at the WTO until unless everything gets agreed, and everyone has to agree, this is a lethal combination. Basically, it means it's a recipe for things not moving very quickly.
Asia is also putting more focus on these big region-to-region deals. We've got the EU, ASEAN, FTA, which is starting to sound more positive. We've also got the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which Japan has just entered into negotiations. How do you see this shaping up, and what will the successful passage of these negotiations mean for Asia?
So we basically see a proliferation of many trading agreements taking place. So just to give you some perspective, in 1991 there were 6 trading agreements in Asia. Today there are 166 of them and 60 more being negotiated. So this leads to something called a noodle bowl of trading arrangements. It adds a lot of complexity. So I think while these will be useful in terms of increasing the role of Asia, the level of complexity which is arising, I think, is becoming very high.
What is the difference in benefits from a country or region signing a bilateral deal compared to a multilateral one? Are the bilateral deals perhaps better at lowering trade barriers?
So the bilateral ones are better at reducing barriers quickly. The question also becomes, are they better at reducing barriers in a sustainable fashion? And there it's not clear. Bilateral trading arrangements are easier to reverse compared to multilateral trading arrangements. So multilateral trading arrangements, I feel, is a much more stronger commitment to trade liberalization than bilateral liberalization. The second thing is that many of these bilateral trade agreements are between asymmetric powers. So think about US versus Colombia. Obviously, US has all of the negotiating advantage versus Colombia in any free trade arrangement. In the multilateral Doha round kind of talks, the smaller countries have a much more powerful voice. So it's better for smaller powers to actually liberalize trade through the WTO rather than to do this bilaterally. And the final thing is that the bilateral trading arrangement, it does 2 things. It can lead to creation of trade between pairs of countries, or it could divert trade. So this is basically moving trade around. Instead of trade going to that country, it basically happens between the 2 of us. Economists will tell you, to the extent that trade creation takes place, it's good. To the extent that trade diversion takes place, it's not good, because this is just moving stuff around. The problem with the bilateral trading arrangements is a lot of it is simply moving stuff around. So there's not that much trade creation.
So is a global agreement on trade still the best way to go?
Absolutely. I think that's the best way to go. I mean, it's slow. It's going to take a long time, but I think all countries should try at least. A very good case in point was the last financial crisis. During the last financial crisis, as compared to the Great Depression, we do not observe trade wars. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, which was the last very big crisis, countries went into trade wars with each other. Here it was minuscule. There were a little bit of trade wars, but not much. Why? Because most of the countries were part of the WTO, and the WTO doesn't allow unilateral changes in tariffs. So we did not get these kind of smooth, holly tariffs or very protectionist policies as a response to the crisis. So global trade fell, of course, but it didn't shrink so dramatically as it would have if trade wars had started, and the WTO was responsible for that. Bilateral trading arrangements, regional trading arrangements are much easier to renege on, much easier to step back and renege on.
Pushan, thank you for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.
It was my pleasure.